What's up, gang? Today's video I'm talking all about strategies for deer hunting locations that you've never been to. We're going in blind. My name is Clint Campbell, and if you're new to the channel, we talk about all deer hunting related strategies, tips, tactics, with the goal of helping all of us become a better bow hunter. If you've not subscribed, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification to make sure that you get the latest videos and podcasts coming. You might hear people refer to this method of hunting or this approach as freestyle or freelance hunting. All it really means is that you're taking an aggressive approach to hunting a piece of land that you have either limited information about or zero information about. The one important thing you're going to want to consider whenever you're applying this approach is the property size. Now, you can absolutely apply this approach to hunting to either small parcels or large parcels, but if it is a smaller parcel, you're going to want to kind of take more care with how you're approaching, especially when you get into your access or your entry and access routes. That's why I prefer and really use this and rely on this approach when I'm hunting larger chunks of public land in the several thousand acre kind of range. There's really three ways to look at and define what this style of hunting really is. First, it's going into a piece of public land or a piece of land in general that you have zero to limited knowledge about and kind of scouting, hunting your way through, looking for the best sign, the hottest sign, the freshest sign to set up on. Two, it's hunting a location that you've previously hunted or scouted, and maybe you've been in your setup for a little while, but as the hunt has worn on, you recognize that what you were expecting to play out really isn't playing out. And so you're pulling all your gear, making a move into some new areas that maybe you're not familiar with, looking for a better setup. Three, whenever you get to a preset location that you've scouted in the past, and when you've got there, the sign doesn't look as good as what you thought it was going to look. So that might be, for example, a hunt, say in October, where you did your scouting in the off season and you found a bunch of scrapes and maybe some rubs. And whenever you show up for your hunt the next season in October, the scrapes aren't open yet. So that's really not a spot worth throwing a hunt at. You're probably going to want to move on to the next best location. The first thing I like to do whenever I'm going to do a freelance or a freestyle hunt is, it's one thing to walk into a piece of property blind. It's another to walk into a piece of property unprepared. And so what I like to do is rely on some e-scouting to kind of get a sense of the property, get a sense of what the terrain looks like, get a sense of what the habitat and vegetation might look like, all from satellite imagery. There's a lot of great digital tools to use that you can quickly do this to kind of get your bearings about a piece of property. What these tools will allow you to do is just get a really quick read or a quick sense of what direction you might want to go or what direction you want to start walking whenever you get to the piece. Now, what I also think about whenever I'm looking at this map, and this might happen while I'm in a, if I'm in a tree and I'm not seeing what I want to see and I need to make a move, I'll pull up, my Onyx Hunt, app while I'm in the tree, take a look and figure out where the next best place might be. Or it might be in the evening before the hunt, or it could be while I'm sitting in the truck. I know I'm going to hunt this piece in the morning. And so I drive to it, and I may just sit in my truck for an extra 15, 20 minutes and go over the map to see what direction I want to start walking in whenever I start my hunt. But what I do whenever I'm looking at the map or whenever I'm kind of walking in and getting ready for one of these freelance hunts is I'm really thinking through things, in terms of seasonality and what's going to be working or what's going to be in my best interest to prioritize based on the time of year that I'm hunting. So, for example, if we're talking about early season, I'm going to focus on areas where I think there may be bedding and food and the travel route between those two. Or I might be thinking about those transitions that deer may use as they're making their way from bed to food, where they might hang up for a little bit while they're waiting for the cover of dark to move out into that primary food source. When it gets to pre-rut and rut, I'm really going to focus on that transition of habitat that create those defined kind of transition lines and edges within the timber. Deer, of course, are creatures of edge, and it becomes, in my opinion, even more pronounced whenever you get into that pre-rut and rut time period, because you're going to likely lay down a lot of sign in those areas where they're traveling most frequently, especially if you have those areas that have a lot of really great side cover. Those are great places to find, and I'll prioritize those places in this time of year during the pre-rut and rut to find those primary scrape areas, active scrapes, those primary scrapes where you're going to have a handful of scrapes in a small area. Those, to me, during that time of year are a gold mine, and I'll try to define where those places might pop up when I'm looking at the map before I walk in. During late season and post gun season, I'm really looking for those areas on the map that are hard to reach and hard to get into that may have limited people from getting there during the course of the season. And again, I'm looking for that heavy cover where deer can kind of take sanctuary during those high pressure times of the year. The other thing I'm looking for is if I can define a spot that has food within the security cover. So if you can figure out where there's some oaks, maybe that there's leftover acorns on the ground, or red oaks that dropped after the white oaks dropped that are in security cover. Those are all places where I would kind of pinpoint on the map before I walk in of places of interest that I want to check out and hike and scout my way to. Let's go to the map real quick, and I'll show you an example of what I might look for in an e-scout and how I've used this same process, in the past to set up a hunt, particularly a freestyle hunt. So I was hunting this piece of property here in Pennsylvania. This is a piece of public land in PA, near where I live, and I was hunting the western side of the property. And I had a couple trail camera pictures of 2 decent deer that I was trying to kill. And they were eluding me on the west side of the property. I knew that west side was going to get more hunting pressure than the eastern side. It had the easiest access, so if I didn't kill that deer early, it probably wasn't going to happen in the setup that I thought that I had for him. Once I recognized that I wasn't probably going to get a shot opportunity at him on the western side of the property, I then, focused my attention on the eastern side of the property and decided to just do a freelance hunt and see if I could run into him. Before I walked in, I took a look at the map real quick. And from the prior hunts that I had had on the western side of the property, a lot of the sign told me that the deer were likely bedding on the north of that piece of public on private. And rightly so, it doesn't get a lot of pressure over there. There's not a ton of hunting that happens in this particular area, especially on private property. So I knew that he was probably safe on that north end of the property or even over on the private. So I knew my best bet was going to be to try to find some type of security cover that was near this swamp, because I'm going to get that diversity of vegetation along that swamp that's going to provide some great browse. And if I could get lucky and find some type of oak flat in there that had, a really great October food source, that would probably be my best bet to try to catch up with him on this property. So what I ended up doing was hiking my way through from the south of this property here and made my way up to this general area, where I ended up finding an oak flat with a handful of oak trees that were dropping. And there was a ton of just thick, nasty cover here along this swamp that you would expect. So that's where I set up. I ended up having an encounter with that deer. Didn't get an arrow in him, but it just confirmed what I had thought, which was he came from the north. And then whenever he saw me, he ended up busting me in the tree. He ended up running back to the north, which I assumed he was running back to the cover where he felt, the most safe. So once the hunt was over, I actually went back a couple of days later and just did a scout of the property and scouted to the north. And sure enough, I found one of his beds just to the north that was on the edge of the public and private line. So this is a lot of times how I'll use a map really quickly. I didn't dive in and dissect it. There was a little bit of terrain here that I wanted to kind of check out. So when I made my way in, I kind of followed this terrain, this topo line in, and assumed that if he was traveling along here, it would probably be along this line. And sure enough, I found a great oak setup, or a great acorn setup, and ended up having an encounter with my target deer. Now that I showed you on the map what I look for whenever I'm e-scouting and how I kind of got into that property, it's like we'll go back to the map really quick, and I just show you, my access points as I had two. And what I was really looking for is you need to think about access in relationship to wind. And so where I came in was from the south on the first hunt, or the first time I scouted my way in to try to catch up with that deer. And I had a northwest wind, which was what I wanted, because I don't want to walk directly with my face into the wind. I want to have a little bit of a crosswind. That way, I'm not necessarily walking directly in the direction that I think the deer may be looking whenever they're bedded with the wind to their back. The other access point I had here was just to the east along this private property line, and I'd be using this if I had a direct north wind. That way I could cut the wind a little bit, thinking that the deer would be looking directly south. I may be able to come in on a little bit of a crosswind to get close enough if the deer was bedded. Fortunately, the deer was actually bedded just a little further away, so that wasn't necessarily a huge issue. The other thing, whenever you're accessing these pieces on a freelance hunt, that you need to think about is, what's your exit strategy? How are you getting out of there? For me, the exit strategy, because I'm in an area that has a lot of, there's the farm here to the east, and so there's a lot of, noise and tractors and stuff that are running. So for me to exit, I really kind of booked it straight to the east, and went up to this private property line and walked this private property line down to the road. And that was kind of typically how I would get out of there on those particular winds. So there's a couple things to think about here, whenever we're going to do a freelance hunt, whenever it comes to entry and exit. You need to be careful about how you perform your entrance, particularly on morning hunts. For freelance hunting, I typically won't go in until after I've got some daylight. The last thing I want to do is go into a piece of property that I don't know a whole lot about, or maybe know zero about. It's really easy to get hung up in brush and make a ton of noise and spook a bunch of deer and kill your hunt before it even starts, just because you can't see. So a lot of times I'll wait till I get enough daylight to where I can see, and typically want to wait until deer get back to bed before I start to make my move through the timber. The other thing you'll want to think about too, in terms of your entry and exit, if you are hunting in an area that, say for example, let's go to the map here over on the west side of that property. Let's say you're going in to hunt this double inside corner, this general area here, right on the map. And if you're entering, from the access point that's down here to the south, I'm probably going to walk this property line up in, right? And I'm going to walk this field edge, but I'm going to come in the morning. I'm going to come in after daylight, after everything's out of this field. I'm going to walk. I typically don't want to walk the edge of the field because deer are edge animals. They're going to want to walk that edge as well. So I'm going to stay just off the edge of that, maybe 20, 30 yards, and keep my scent out in the middle of this field, come in, and then perpendicular my way into a tree that I want to hunt. Now for my exit, I'm anticipating there's going to be deer in this food source here. So my exit is likely going to be through the timber, and I'm going to stay away from the edges of the field. So I may then exit walking to the south here, all the way down until I get to the road, and then take the road out to the parking spot. So those are ways that you might have to use different entrance and exit depending on the area that you're hunting, if it's a food source that you're hunting, what time of day you're getting in and out. So those are just a few things that you'll need to think about. One of the things I like to do to extend my hunts a little bit, that I used a lot while I was in Iowa, especially if it's a place where I'm on a destination hunt where I'm out of state. When I go in, let's say I go in around 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, 9:30 after the deer are back to bed, and I'm going in and I'm freelancing my way in, and I find a spot. I find a primary scrape area that I really like, and I set up on it, right? And say maybe after I got in and scouted, I got to it and found it at, say, 2 o'clock, and I'm going to hunt till dark, and say it's 5:30 or whatever. What I'll end up doing is I'll look at the weather while I'm in the tree and see if the next day's wind will be good for that same setup. Because if it is, I'll leave my stuff in the tree, and I'll end up going back in the morning, because now I know how to get in and out of there in the dark, and I'll be able to use that same setup to catch an early morning hunt. So I can catch that gray light time period where you're getting in an hour and a half before the sun comes up. And then maybe I'll hunt it till like 9:30, 10 o'clock. If I don't see the movement I want to see, I'm down on the ground, I'm moving, I'm finding the next spot, and I'm setting up for that evening again. And if the wind is right the next day for that spot, I'll do the same thing over and over again and just kind of rinse and repeat. So now that we understand what freelance hunting is, what are we looking for in terms of sign? We're really looking for places that are going to aggregate deer in a concentrated area, and specifically bucks, and what bucks are looking for. So we're going to look for a combination of food sources, terrain features, and the sign that's related to those things. So as far as food sources go, I'm going to speak about just particularly in the timber. You're going to look for those areas where they have browse close to bedding. If you can find acorns or an oak tree that's dropping acorns, those are dynamite. One of the things I like to do is maybe get a little bit of elevation if I can, especially if all the leaves are off the trees and I can see a long ways. A lot of times those oak trees are the last ones to hold their leaves. And so if you can get a little elevation, see a pocket of trees that are holding leaves still, there's a good chance there's going to be an oak tree in that general area, and it might be dropping acorns. So that's a place that I would probably beeline to and check out on a freelance hunt. The other thing you're going to want to look for is just a general deer sign that you're always kind of looking for. So one of the ones that I prioritize, and that for me, if I find it kind of trumps everything else, are primary scrape areas. And what a primary scrape area is that it's basically an aggregate of a handful of scrapes, anywhere from like 3 to 6, 7, however many it takes, depending on the deer density in your area and the activity in your area. But it's all these scrapes in a small area, and it might be like in a 20-yard area, you've got like 5 scrapes. To me, especially if it's up against side cover or even better yet, in bedding cover, or if it's adjacent to what you think is bedding, that is about as hot a sign as I'll find. and I'll definitely set up on that. You want to look at the scrape and see if it's still hot. Is the ground still pawed up, or has the dew kind of smashed it down? Has it rained? If you find those right after a rain, those are dynamite, because those bucks are going to be back to tend those scrapes at some point during the course of the day, hopefully. And the reason why I prioritize those ones that are in that bedding cover with side cover is because those are the ones that are going to be used in daylight. Those ones that are along the field edges, especially in states like Pennsylvania or out in the open in high pressure states, that's all nighttime activity. And so I usually don't even pay attention to those. I walk right past those, and I'm heading and trying to find ones, primary scrape areas that are located in cover. The other thing you're going to want to look for as well, we're always kind of looking for these things, are rub lines and scrape lines. Scrape lines I do like. I still prioritize those primary scrape areas, but if I find a line of scrapes, I will tend to follow them until I get into an area where I feel like I'm getting into that bedding kind of cover kind of area. Same thing with rub lines. Now, rub lines for me personally, I probably pay a little bit more attention to those earlier in the season. As the season shifts and more scrapes start to get laid down, I really pay more attention to those scrape lines. And a lot of times those are along, or can be along just really heavily traveled deer paths or runways. And so those are also great setups just in terms of how much traffic might be coming along those particular areas. The other thing I'm going to look for is just those terrain features that are funneling deer down and pinching deer down. If I find that on a map, I'm going to make my way to that as well. It's a nice place to aggregate deer sign. Again, you have to evaluate it with how much cover is around you. But for example, if you're hunting, the rut time period, and with pretty good certainty that you have two different bedding areas one on each side, and you find a definitive kind of travel route based on a terrain feature between those two bedding areas, that's a dynamite place to set up. I don't think I have to tell anybody that, but that would be a place I would definitely check out and make my way toward while I'm freelancing my way through. When we're freelancing through pieces of property, we don't always know where the bedding's at, and we don't always necessarily know what direction the deer are coming from. But, we can basically, as much time as we spend in the woods, you can start to make some guesses based on the topo, based on the terrain, and based on where you think the food sources are. You can start to kind of narrow down where you think bedding is, and maybe even where you think the pressure is coming from. You can kind of start to understand where deer are going to aggregate during the day. So I'll show you another example on the map for an area that really worked for me, where I used this approach. I didn't really know anything about the piece of property. Freelanced my way in and was able to have an encounter with a deer that I had a picture on a different piece of the property. So this piece of property, I ended up hanging a trail camera on the western side of the property. I just kind of happened to stop by one day when I was driving by. I didn't know anything about it. There was a couple food sources. It was summer, so I was like, let me hang a camera here and see if there's any deer on this piece. I came back late summer, had a shooter on camera that I was wanting to possibly kill. It was one of the 3 deer in PA that I was going to try to kill this year. And so I knew that side of the property wasn't going to be the place I was going to hunt, just based on how easy the access was. But there was a western side of the property where I felt like if I were a mature deer, that's probably where I would spend most of my time. And so I went in to hunt the one day, didn't know anything about this side of the property. I took a look at the map, and when I zoom in here, what I noticed is when I got over to here, this little grove that opens up, I assumed if I were a buck, I would probably bed over on this side. It's adjacent to a swamp, and I doubt it's going to get a whole lot of pressure, because I had assumed that the habitat back here was just nasty, swampy, thick, because most of the rest of the property was pretty swampy. And this, clearly, if you move over here, you can see where you have all these dead trees and it's just a big kind of marshy mess. So I'd assume that there was a buck that was bedded back there somewhere, or at least one that was living in that general area that would be making its way toward this food in the evening. When I freelanced my way in, I came in with a straight west wind, which was fine for me. I was going to be blowing into all these, food sources here, but I was going to come in from the north and make my way down along this edge, and I really wanted to get back into this mess over here. So I made my way along this edge. I hit this little grove here, and whenever I was walking through this grove, I noticed just a bunch of scrapes in a general area against this really thick side cover. And what I realized whenever I got in here, all this here around my cursor had been select cut and was just super thick and would be a great place for a deer to bed. So as I made my way through here, I recognized that there were like 6 scrapes that were all opened up within close proximity to one another. And then here, right along this really thick little edge, there was one little trail that came out where there were a bunch of rubs in here and a bunch of small saplings and stuff that had been broken off. And so what I had thought was, by looking at the map previously and e-scouting before I walked in, I was like, this would be a spot, if I were a buck, where I would spend some time. I'd probably lay down scrapes here because I don't have to expose myself, and I'd probably get left alone back here in this swamp. So once I saw that, I ended up setting up in the south end of that oak grove, overlooking those scrapes, and the closest one to me was about 20 yards, and I set up near that one because it was the one that the licking branch was actually broken off and looked like it had been tended the most often. The others had licking branches but didn't seem to be as beat up as the one that was closest to the tree that I wanted to hunt out of. So I ended up setting up there. Right at last light, a deer started working its way out. By the time he got out and presented an opportunity at that scrape, I had lost shooting light and just had to watch him walk away. So whenever you're freelancing your way through and you're scouting your way through, last but not least, and it may sound crazy, look for deer. One of the things I think people get too kind of worked up over is bumping deer. Bumping deer is just part of how this process of hunting kind of plays out. Sometimes I feel like the best information I get is when I bump a deer. I know that there are deer there. I have proof of life. Again, I'm doing this on larger chunks of land where it's like I may be bumping that deer or that buck off, but it doesn't mean that another one's not going to come in into that general area. So, don't view bumping deer as something bad. View it as that you just got another piece of intel. You also know what direction it ran. It's likely running toward an area where it's going to feel safe and has really good cover. An aspect that's critical to this style of hunting is making sure that you're picking the right tree. We're walking in blind in most cases, and we're looking for that freshest, hottest sign, the best setup that we can possibly find as we're hunting and scouting our way through the timber. When you choose a tree, you're going to want to choose a tree that's going to give you the best shot opportunity to that sign that you had found. So for example, the example I just gave in that setup that I had in that little oak grove, I chose that tree specifically that I wanted to get into because I knew I had a 20-yard shot to what I call like the destination, sign that I was going to hunt over. So it does me no good to set up, 40 yards from something or 50 yards from something. I want to be where the deer is ultimately going to be, and I want to set up to give myself the best and easiest shot opportunity that I can possibly get. After thinking about all the things that you take into consideration, it might seem a little daunting to take on freestyle hunting, but at the end of the day, you're really just being a woodsman and you're being a hunter. You're walking in, you're reading the sign, you're surveying the land, you're paying attention to topo, you're paying attention to vegetation, you're paying attention to when you see deer and what direction they're ultimately moving. For me, freelance hunting has become my preferred way to hunt, especially if I'm out of state, with limited information about a particular area. This is pretty much 95% of the way I'm gonna hunt a piece of property. So if I were gonna boil this down and have you remember just 3 things: pay attention to your access, your entry and exit, in the wind, in a relationship to those. You'll blow up more hunts before they even get started if you don't pay attention to those things. Think about the time of year that you're hunting and how to prioritize the sign based on the time of year that you're hunting. Make sure that you pick the right tree and that you're playing it for the shot opportunity at that destination spot or that destination sign, which is what made you stop in that particular area in the first place. And last, don't be afraid to scrap an area entirely. If you've hiked in and you scouted your way in and you found sign to set up on, you get set up and you just don't have a good feeling about it, you've sat a couple hours, scrap it, pull your stuff, and move on. There's no reason to sit somewhere where you don't have confidence that you'll be able to kill, that you won't be able to kill a buck in that particular area. So with that, I hope this video helps you guys fill some tags. Be sure to leave a comment below. I'd love to answer any of the questions you have about freelance hunting or planning an out-of-state hunt. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification to make sure you get all the upcoming videos and podcasts.